Good morning. This is Rachel Van, NC State Soybean Extension Specialist. I am again joined by my colleagues, Dr. Dominic Reising, Lindsay Thiessen, and Wes Everman. And we are here this morning to talk to you about some early planted soybean considerations or just some early season soybean considerations in general. I would first like to apologize to anybody that was on the Zoom call on Friday for the technology issues that we encountered. We have had to impose some additional security measures for the webinar today, and so everybody is locked on mute during the presentation component of this. We would ask that everyone's video is off. If your video is not off, we will turn it off. And nobody should have the ability to annotate the slides in this presentation. So I'm going to give about a 20 to 25 minute presentation on some early planted soybean considerations. And then what we were really hopeful for in this webinar was that we would have a dialogue with the folks attending and you would have the ability to ask us questions. So once we get through the presentation, we'll lift a couple of the security restrictions to try to foster some of that discussion. But during the presentation, you can use the chat box to interact if you've got questions during the presentation. So if you look at our soybean production guide, the optimum planting period is identified as May 1 to June 10. And Dr. Dunphy would talk about you've planted soybeans early enough if they've lapped the middles or gotten to canopy closure. There are multiple benefits of that, but one of them is to maximize photosynthetic capacity. It's been well documented across the Mid-Atlantic region that when you get on the later end of that time frame, so middle of June, growers are losing about a half a bushel per acre a day with each delay in planting. But what about on the front end of that time period of optimum soybean production in the state, which has historically been identified as May 1 to June 10? And why are we interested in earlier planting dates anyways? Well, one of the very practical reasons is that we've seen a big decline in double crop soybean acreage in this state. In 2019, we had less than 30% of our soybean acres planted in double crop. Whereas just 6 years prior in 2013, there was over 60% of our acreage planted to double crop, which means that we've got a lot more farmers in the state that are planting full season soybeans, which can facilitate earlier than normal planting dates. That coupled with the fact that across the whole United States, there's interest in earlier planting of soybeans. So I grew up in rural Illinois near Moline, and a lot of those farmers historically would always plant corn first and then soybeans. But many of them are now planting both crops at the same time, if not soybeans earlier. So across the US, folks have been looking at this phenomenon, finding that if growers across the US would have planted 12 days earlier, it would have resulted in a 10% greater soybean yield. In the Southeast specifically, they found our growers could be planting up to 30 days earlier, which I'll remind folks, 30 days earlier for soybean planting for a lot of the growers in the state could be early to mid-May. So Dr. Catherine Stowe with the Soybean Producers Association and I are working on trying to summarize some of the data sets that we have from the NC Soybean Yield Contest over the past 18 years, where we have about 808 entries. And one of the things we've been looking at is the impact of planting date in these yield contest entries. So here on the x-axis, we've got our planting dates, April through July. Then on the y-axis, we've got yield. And you can see in these yield contest entries that we see a strong decline in yield as our planting dates are delayed. Now let's shift to looking at some planting date data that we do have from tests that are being run in the state. And this data is from the Maturity Group 5 tests in our official variety testing program. We're looking at data for over 3 years in both our full season and double crop OBT tests. So the same varieties are evaluated in our full season and double crop tests. The only difference is planting date. So in the full season test, the soybeans are planted in the middle of May. In the double crop test, the soybeans are planted in the middle of June. So we can look at the yields in those two tests, same varieties evaluated over the last 3 years, and see that the advantage of those earlier planting dates was anywhere from 10 to 15 bushels per acre. Let's look at what we've seen over the past 5 years for soybean crop progress planted in the state. So if we look at the 5-year average, soybean acres that are planted by May 19th were 32%. If we look at what was planted by June 9th, it was 65%. So we'll assume that most of the soybeans that are planted after June 9th are double crop soybeans. But that still means that half of our full season acreage could potentially still benefit from earlier planting dates. So if you are thinking about going to start planting earlier than mid-May, when should you start planting? We've been getting a lot of questions over the past couple of weeks from growers, especially last week, that intended to start planting cotton, but because it was cool and wet, we're considering planting soybeans. When can you get started? Well, we don't have a lot of recently generated information from our research programs about really early soybean planting. We do have a graduate student project in place where this graduate student is looking at planting dates from anywhere from mid-March through late July, and variety of maturity groups and seeding rates at each of those planting dates. So we started this trial in 2019 and we're continuing it over the next few years. We started planting this year at the beginning of April, but we can talk a little bit about some preliminary data that we saw in this trial in 2019. So if we look at the planting date impact on soybean yields, we're combining over all the maturity groups, all the seeding rates, and all these locations in 2019. We saw the highest yields with planting dates in early to mid-May. Yields were lower when soybeans were planted in mid-April and lower again when soybeans were planted in late March. There might be a few reasons for that. One of them is that when you're planting really early with these earlier maturing varieties, we saw some high levels of damage. So that's one of the issues. Another issue is that when you're planting really early, some of these soybeans may be flowering so far in advance of the summer solstice that they're not maximizing on photosynthesis on those longest days of the year. And one more consideration that could be very specific to 2019 is many of you will remember it was very hot for several weeks in May in 2019, and that could have created some unfavorable conditions for our early maturing soybeans that were planted early. Another advantage of earlier planting is simply that it allows you to finish soybean planting at an optimal time. So the growers in the state have a lot of rotational complexity, a lot of things going on. If a pocket opens up where you might be able to plant some soybeans earlier than normal on your full season acreage, hopefully what that would allow is your total full season soybean acreage to be planted at a more optimum time, mid to late May. I called Dr. Dunphy. I said, you know, we're giving a seminar on early planted soybeans and kind of wanted to get his perspective on this. And one quote that he provided was, I would rather gamble on late April soybean planting than late May soybean planting. Why is that? Well, simply you have a better chance to get your soybeans up and get the middles lapped into canopy closure when you're planting in late April than you do when you're planting in late May. So soybeans are less sensitive to planting into cool, wet soils than cotton. And that, coupled with the fact that there clears to be no disadvantage to planting soybeans in late April, might incentivize some growers to start planting soybeans this week. I talked to Dr. Guy Collins, who's one of our cotton extension specialists, and based on their model for recommending cotton planting dates in the state, he said they likely wouldn't be recommending any cotton planting until the end of this week, and that's at the earliest, and that's in the southern part of North Carolina. So that could open up some opportunities for early soybean planting. Last time I checked, soil temps across most of the state were running 55 to 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And when I was getting ready to prepare this seminar, I reached out to some of our colleagues in the upper Midwest asking, what's the lowest threshold for planting soybeans that y'all recommend? Obviously, a lot of those growers are planting into cooler conditions than we are. And they said that they'll recommend planting soybeans as cool as 45 degrees soil temp as long as there's not a cool rain in the upcoming forecast for 48 hours. So we're well past that point here this year in North Carolina at 55 to 60 degrees. So if folks wanted to get started planting soybeans this week, we think that could be a good choice to try to facilitate earlier planting of your whole crop. So in that graduate student trial I mentioned last year, we had a couple really early planting dates in mid-March in Sampson and Yadkin counties. Soil temps were 52 to 53 degrees Fahrenheit. And it did take those soybeans a while to get out of the ground, 20 to 25 days, but the seed was treated and eventually they did come up. Freeze damage is not likely on emerged soybeans unless you have 28 degrees Fahrenheit or below for 4 or more hours. So hopefully we're out of the chance of those conditions for most of the state at this point in the season. And another question we're going to get is, if I'm going to start planting earlier than normal, then what maturity group should I be using? Let's first look at our full season OVT data. So our full season soybean tests are planted in the middle of May. And this is data from 2017 through 2019. So on the x-axis, we have maturity group, and on the y-axis, we've got yield. And what I want to point out is across all 3 years, although slight in 2017 and 2018 and stronger in 2019, we see a trend towards declining yield as maturity group increases, which would mean that on average, you'd have the best chance of choosing a high yielding variety in a full season situation from an earlier maturing variety. What did we see in that big project looking at planting date maturity group in 2019? I have the early planting dates here. We'll look at maturity group on the x-axis and yield on the y-axis. The mid-March and late March planting dates did not yield as high as the April, early May, and mid-May planting dates, but with the April and May planting dates, you can see that we saw our highest yields with our maturity groups 4 and 5 in that trial in 2019, which is consistent with what we've seen from the OVT data. What was something that we identified as a theme amongst these high yielding maturity group and planting date combinations in 2019? Well, our students were capturing beginning flowering across the state. They were recording when these maturity group and planting date combinations started to flower. But we also have a tool that we can use to predict that, which I'll highlight here in a moment. But something we noticed about a lot of these planting date maturity group combinations is they were flowering around the middle of June, which is often when growers are targeting getting their soybeans to flower to try to maximize photosynthesis. How did we predict that? We predicted that using a tool that has been developed out of the Mid-South region called SoyStage. And I am going to highlight this tool here momentarily. What this tool can do is allow you to enter emergence date and maturity group, and it can predict some reproductive growth stages for soybeans. What is the functionality of this? Well, I've used this a couple times recently in the past couple of weeks to answer some extension questions when growers were wondering, if I plant this maturity group at this time, when will it be flowering? So I'm going to stop the screen share on this presentation right now and take you to highlighting this tool. Let's see. So this is the SoyStage tool. I'm going to first talk about a couple limitations of this tool for North Carolina. This tool was developed out of the Mid-South. Let's remember the two things that primarily control flowering in soybeans: photo period or night length, and temperature. This tool is fed with temperature data from the Mid-South, which is going to be different than our temperature data in North Carolina. So that's one limitation of using this tool. The other limitation of using this tool is it's only in 0.5 maturity group increments from 3 to 7. So those are a couple limitations, but we don't have a tool like this, which has been developed in North Carolina. So it can help us predict approximate time ranges for some of the parameters we might be interested in. So I'm going to run this tool here. And if I'm a grower thinking about planting earlier than normal, especially if I'm thinking about planting an earlier maturing variety, the first thing I want to know is when is this planting date by maturity group combination going to be ready to harvest, and can I be ready at that time? So let's say you decided you were going to plant soybeans tomorrow. We'll assume that they're going to emerge around May 2nd. That's an assumption here, but I want to highlight again, this uses emergence date for the soybeans, not planting date. And let's say you have purchased maturity groups 4.2 and 5.7, and you want to know which one you should plant in your early planting situation. Well, you can come in here and plug 4.2 in. Remember, this tool only allow you to go in 0.5 maturity group increments. And I would first come over here and say, when is this planting date by maturity group combination going to hit R7, which is physiological maturity? And R7 is about 7 to 10 days prior to harvestable pods. So let's say your field's around Raleigh. What you can do is you want to move over to this tool in a latitude that's comparable to Raleigh. Soybeans are flowering is largely controlled by photoperiod, which is consistent across latitudes. So I would come over here in a latitude comparable to Raleigh and say, okay, if my beans emerged on May 2nd and I planted a maturity group 4.2, then these soybeans were going to get to R7 around the end of August. I would need to be ready to harvest these about 10 days later than that. Does that fit into my operation? So that's the first question I would ask. Then you can come and look at this maturity group and planting date combination and see when these soybeans are going to flower. So when are these beans going to flower? Well, these are going to flower June 9th, plus or minus 3 days. That's what that standard deviation means. It's going to be larger than that for our area, since this is not the temperature data from our region, but it does allow you to get approximation. So if the grower was asking, should I plant a 4.2 or should I plant a 5.7? We can come here and do the same thing for a maturity group 5.7. When is that going to hit R1? Let's say right around the middle of June. 625 based on this prediction. And when is that maturity group by planting date or emergence date combination going to be at physiological maturity? Somewhere around September 12th. So then you'd have to be ready to harvest your soybeans more in later September, and maybe that fits better into your operation. So I just wanted to highlight that this tool is available to folks to predict some of these planting date and maturity group combinations if you know that you're trying to get your soybeans to flower at a certain time, or if you know that a certain harvest time fits into your operation. This is a tool that can be used, and we can play around with this tool later if you want to when we get through this presentation. Let me try to get to the next slide here. So if you were at the county meetings this winter, one of the things we wanted to emphasize about earlier planting, especially coupled with earlier maturing varieties, is the impact on seed quality. So let's say you would have picked that soybean emergence date of May 2nd if you planted this week, and maturity group 4.2. your beans would be coming into physiological maturity in August. When it's wet, it can be humid, and there's potentially harvest delays if that doesn't fit well in your operation. You can see some issues like Phomopsis seed decay, pictured here with this chalky white seed, or purple seed stain caused by Cercospora. And so another important consideration of the earlier than normal planting system is seed quality and your ability to harvest on time. So here's some data from the trial that we had with planting dates and maturity groups in 2019. On the x-axis here, we've got our various planting dates, and on the y-axis, we've got damage. Our team was trained by the NCDA to quantify damage the same way it's done when our growers take their beans to the elevator. And what you can see with these really early planting dates is that we did see some high levels of damage, especially with the maturity groups 2 and 3. As you push planting into mid-May to late May, those damage levels really declined, especially when you push planting past late May. So I recognize that most growers in the state have already selected their soybean varieties for 2020, but some still have not. We're still getting calls in extension about variety selection. And as you're thinking about the best maturity group to plant and then the best variety to plant, I just want to make sure that we highlight this excellent resource that we have in the state for variety selection. This was developed by the Soybean Producers Association in North Carolina, and it's fed with our OVT data. This tool is very powerful. We can demonstrate this tool later if folks have questions, but I'll give you an example from a question that I had last week. A grower called, they wanted to plant a Liberty Link variety. They were going to go ahead and plant last week, even though that was earlier than normal for them. They were trying to decide between a maturity group 4 and 5. So we did some simulations through that soy stage tool, but we also went into the variety selection tool and looked up Liberty Link varieties. So we filtered by Liberty Link. All of a sudden, then we were looking at yield data from 30 varieties instead of 200. And then we filtered by maturity group 4 and 5. And so what that did was really simplify the variety selection process. And this is an excellent tool that we hope folks will really start utilizing more. I'm going to mention a couple more things that are important when we're thinking about this early planting system. One of them is the use of a fungicidal seed treatment. So Dr. Dunphy had a big trial looking at non-foliar yield enhancement products. There were various ones, but one of them was a fungicidal seed treatment. We analyzed that data and found there was no impact on soybean yield. But those trials are planted from late May through early June. When we're talking about planting earlier, do we need a fungicidal seed treatment then? So in 2019 and in 2020 and probably 2021 as well, we've got a trial where we're looking at some earlier soybean planting dates, some earlier maturing varieties, and some fungicidal seed treatments compared to an untreated control. If we look at our 2019 data, which I'll call preliminary at this point, we'd ideally like to have a couple years of data. At 2 of our 3 sites, we saw a protection of stand from the use of a fungicidal seed treatment. At both the sites where we got yield data, we saw protection of yield from the use of a fungicidal seed treatment, anywhere from 6 to 7 bushels per acre. This is a picture of a field at our crop operators, the Sullivans in Sampson County. We planted these soybeans in the middle of March, and you can see here in the middle, this seed that we planted was untreated. These are 3 different maturity groups, but we believe the difference in stand here is attributed to the lack of a fungicidal seed treatment here in the middle, not maturity group differences. We got this particular maturity group treated after the first planting date and saw no stand issues amongst the maturity groups. And I think this picture really just documents what the impact of a lacking fungicidal seed treatment is at these earlier planting dates. If we break down the impact of a fungicidal seed treatment by planting date, we can see that when we were planting in late March, we saw a 9 bushel per acre yield protection from a fungicidal seed treatment. Mid-April, that was 6 bushels per acre protection. In mid-May, 2.5 bushels per acre. So should you use a fungicidal seed treatment when you're planting earlier than you're historically used to planting? Well, I would be considering it if I was planting before mid-May, especially if I was going to get started planting this week. It's been cool, it's been wet, and those conditions are conducive to some of our seedling diseases. The final production consideration I'll mention related to this early planting system that we're inevitably getting questions about is, what about population? So we are trying to generate some more information on populations at really early planting dates, even before May. But it's going to take us a couple years to really be able to refine those recommendations. And so let's look at the very robust seeding rate recommendations that Dr. Dunphy has for May. What you can see here with May planting, which he had over 64 environments, is that yield stabilized when you had 75,000 plants per acre. It's not seeds per acre, that's plants per acre. And yield was stable all the way up to 175,000 plants per acre. That just demonstrates the plasticity of soybeans and yield across a wide range of planting dates. So what you want to make sure is that you have at least 75,000 plants per acre when all is said and done, these early planting situations. So if it was me, knowing that you might have a little more seedling disease pressure than you are generally used to at these earlier planting dates, I would probably go with 110 to 120,000 seeds per acre, depending on the germination of your seed, to ensure that you had this population and give yourself a little breathing room with your final stand. So what we hope today was to just highlight a few considerations for earlier than normal soybean planting. Conditions this year are potentially going to allow folks to plant earlier than normal, not only with the cool, wet conditions preventing cotton planting right now, but also growers across the state have made good progress in corn planting. And so that might facilitate some earlier than normal soybean planting dates. We also hope that this fosters discussion and questions from growers. So I will remind everyone that Dr. Wes Everman, Dominic Reising, and Lindsay Thiessen are here to answer weed science, entomology, pathology questions, as well as myself, to focus on some of the agronomic questions. So at this point, I am going to lift the mute restriction for all of our participants so that you are able to unmute yourself. If you're on your phone, you can do that using *6. If you're on your computer, you can float to the left-hand lower portion of the screen and unmute yourself. And we hope that we can hear some questions from folks.
Good morning. This is Mitch Smith.
Hi, Mitch.
Good morning. My question is, I'm interested in why the trend away from double crop soybeans to full season. Is that due to the fact that maybe wheat wasn't doing it for us and a grower feels a better advantage or better risk in terms of having a full season planting? I'm just interested in what you think about that.
Sure. I can provide a very high level answer, and then any of our growers on the call should feel welcome to weigh in. But I think it's a combination of lower wheat prices, coupled with the fact that a lot of our growers are realizing yield advantages of earlier planting soybeans that might outweigh the economics of planting wheat. But would love to hear from the grower's perspective on that question.
Hey, Rachel, it's Owen. Thanks again for organizing this. That was I guess the same question that I had, and I suspect if we were able to extend that diagram back, 4 or 5 years prior to the price spike in 2012-13, we might be able to shed some light as to whether the trend that we've seen since then is strictly related to the decline in wheat prices.
Yeah, I will say, Owen, I have looked back a little bit further than 2012, and I would say at least 50 to 60% of our acres were planted double crop, in the early 2000s.
Okay.
moving into this. So I think double cropping with soybeans has been more prevalent historically, but sorry, I've got distracted by the chat. But if any growers want to weigh in on that, that would be great. Why are y'all planting less wheat?
Rachel, this is Jeff Tyson. We've been looking earlier. We just typically in the past have not grown wheat. And with the increase in soybean acres, with the reduction in cotton prices, just the logistics of getting the crop in the ground has been one of the big pushes for us to be earlier. And then we started seeing the yield bumps by being earlier. So we started moving in earlier and earlier with our soybean varieties.
Thanks, Jeff.
Rachel, this is Reggie Strickland. I had the reason we quit double cropping is more or less the price of wheat is what pushed us away from planting wheat. But I had a question about, we grow seed beans, and I was told by the seed company that early planted beans, the seed quality was not as good, whereas say the germination of the beans may not be as good. Do you have any research or anything saying whether that's true or not?
Thanks for your question, Reggie. So in our big planting date study that the Soybean Producers Association is funding, where we're looking at planting dates of mid-March, late March, mid-April, these earlier planting dates, we are looking at seed quality. We're taking subsamples out of the combine and analyzing those for damage and also protein and oil. Now, we're not running germ tests on those. I suppose that's something we could do on a subset of the samples if there was interest. What I can say is, yes, we definitely have seen seed quality issues with these earlier planted soybeans. The conditions in which they're coming into physiological maturity are pretty harsh in terms of heat and humidity, and that can intensify some of the disease issues that we might see that can impact seed quality. I don't know if Dr. Lindsay Thiessen wants to weigh in at all. I'm not sure, Reggie, about germination issues. I've not heard about that for seed bean production, but if anybody else wants to weigh in, that'd be great. Lindsay, do you want to add anything?
Sure. The only thing I can maybe see is why it might impact seed quality might be just like what Rachel said, the conducive conditions for pathogens. There may be a lot more humidity around that time, and if you're not able to get the beans out really rapidly, they may sit there too long and have problems with seed decay or other problems. That's my take on it.
And Reggie, one thing, we've not tested this much yet. It's something that's on our agenda, but the growers that are really successful with this system seem to be using fungicide applications with these earlier planted soybeans maturing early, one if not two, as a mechanism to protect seed quality. So that's just something that we hear from the growers that are successfully implementing this system. I know that's required of most seed production anyways.
Yeah, that's true. I say I was trying to get my seed and they would not deliver the seed because they said, it was too early to plant them because of the seed quality, for that, because of the seed production. And they said it was due to germination, and I just never heard that before. So.
Well, that's a good idea, Reggie. It's potentially something we could look at on a small subset of samples. It wouldn't be that difficult for us to run germ tests, if we picked a couple early planting dates and a couple of maturity groups. So something to think about. Thanks.
Reggie, this is Dominic Reisig. You're like Sampson, Wayne County area, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that area of the state can have, it's like a pocket for stink bugs. And
Oh yeah.
I'd say the one thing I'd say about planting date is your later planted beans would be more at risk for stink bugs, and they can affect germination. So obviously not anything to do with the earlier planted agronomic effects on seed quality, but I'd say planting them later puts it more at risk for stink bugs, which could affect germination as well. So maybe something just to push back on if you get that concern about early planting beans as well.
No, thank you.
So this is Curtis Stanley. I grow seed beans also, and we've been told the same thing. So he's not by himself there.
All right, thanks, Curtis. We've definitely seen with earlier planting dates in our research that there's higher levels of damage. If you remember that graph, once we pushed into planting in mid-May, those were largely diminished, but unsure about the impact of germination of the earlier planting on germination of the seed. So that's something that we'll need to look into. Other questions from folks?
Rachel, there's a question in the chat box. What is defined as early?
Okay, Mitch, I see this question now. What's defined as early? Well, I would say very early in the state is before May, but for many of our growers, I think early for full season can even be characterized as middle of May. If we look at that planting progress data that we just shared, only 36% of our growers have had their beans planted by the middle of May over the past 5 years. Now, a pocket of those growers, let's say 30% are double crop acres, and they're not going to get it in until early June at the earliest. But what we're trying to get folks to think about is potentially those that are planting their full season acres in late May or early June. Could they potentially look at earlier planting dates and realize some yield benefits? Now, I think we need a couple more years of recently generated data to definitively say that, but there does seem to be some trends towards earlier soybean planting dates, let's say early to mid-May, leading to higher yields than late May, early June.
Miss Rachel, this is Mike Edwards from Nash County. We have planted some edible soybeans last year for a company out of Virginia. I think the beans were made by or produced by Virginia Tech, and I think they're Group 5. Would they be same consideration as a regular soybean for planting date?
Thanks for your question, Mike. Yep, we would not expect that just because I'm assuming if they're edible, I'm assuming they're conventional variety. Just because they're conventional variety, we would assume that they'd perform similarly to any other maturity group. Now, one thing that you have to be careful of, because they're an edible bean, you might have some more restrictions on the level of damage that they'll accept. And so if you were thinking about planting maturity group 5 really early, I would just be careful that you were committed to very timely harvest to protect that seed quality and potentially fungicide application.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
This question may be for Dr. Thiessen. Is there any particular research being done this year with variations of spraying dates of fungicides and multiples to try to eliminate some of the seed damage that we have? Because at the end of the day, yield is based on what you're paid for, not what goes into the combine.
That's a great question. We had planned to do some of that this year, but I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get those trials out with the reduced labor inputs with the COVID situation. We do have some research going out for nematode control, but we weren't able to get enough exemptions for some of that research. So it may have to wait another year before we can do some of that work. But it is something that we're looking into as far as a question is concerned, is timing a fungicide to protect the soybeans. The biggest consideration for that is that our fungicides really only give us a 14-day window of protection, 21 if we're really lucky. So if we're trying to target maximizing our yield protection for early disease pressures during reproduction, and we're timing for our late season protection, we're going to probably need to make 2 applications. So for early beans, we may just have to make 2 applications of a fungicide to really protect both the reproductive stage control of disease and the later seed control, if that makes any sense.
Hey, and Jay, this is Catherine Stowe with the Soybean Association, but we are funding a trial that's going to be replicated at like 4 locations across the state with some consultants to look at different timings for specifically for seed quality. And Rachel's going to work with us on that in terms of looking at quantifying the damage in those samples.
Thank you.
I'm going to read a couple questions from the chat here. This is from Adrian Boyd. What were the harvest dates on the early planted trial in 2019? Adrian, we started harvesting the first week of August, and usually at our sites we had 5 to 7 harvest dates. So that was like first week of August, third week of August, beginning of September. It just varied by site, but we got going at the beginning of August, and I can provide more specific dates if that's something of interest to you. Mariana Bennett, is this Zoom being recorded and will it be shared? Yes, Mariana, it is being recorded, and we will post it on the Soybean Extensions portal. I'll also send it out to the agent list. The next question from Lewis Smith, did you mention recommending planting depth for early planting? No, Lewis, we didn't make any recommendations about planting depth. I would be curious from the growers if they're adjusting planting depth at these earlier planting dates. As we're putting in our early planting trials, we're just watching the weather, soil conditions, using the optimum planting depth recommendations for soybeans of 3/4 of an inch up to 1.5 inches. But I'd love to hear from any of the growers on the call that are planting early if they're adjusting depth at all because they're planting earlier.
Rachel, this is Jeff Tyson again. I have not changed my planting depth. I kind of figure keeping them shallow, excuse me, has kind of using the sunshine to keep everything a little bit warmer up close to the top. And so far that seems to have worked. Don't have any scientific way to back it up other than they come up good, and the quicker we get them out of the ground, I figure the better they are.
Thanks, Jeff. Anybody else want to weigh in on that or ask another question?
Rachel, this is Jonathan Evans. Fungicides at R3, R4 on effect on the harvest date.
You know, I'm gonna let Lindsay answer that one. Jonathan, are you talking about if they potentially are gonna lead to the beans staying green a little bit longer?
Yeah, if you were planting early, could you harvest them a little bit later, protect them longer?
Yeah, I'll let Lindsay, our pathologist who works more often with fungicides, answer that one.
Can you repeat that one more time? I didn't quite hear you.
If you're planting early, I plant a fungicide at R3 or R4 or later, make it so you can harvest them later.
So if we're applying a fungicide between R3 and R5, it's not gonna let us hold them on any longer. And realistically, fungicides don't work that well at holding plants on. I know it's been a practice in tobacco. The biggest concern I have with doing something like that is if we just kind of blanket apply a fungicide without a disease target in mind, that we might increase our issues with fungicide resistance. And really, the fungicides that people have used for doing that are typically a strobilurin class. And we already have fungicide resistance developed in a number of our pathogens for that. So I don't think it would really help us hold it on. The reason that people have used those in the past is because it can increase some of the greenness, I guess, of the plants. So there's a little bit of time there, but it's not going to keep it on to a normal harvest period if that's how long you're hoping to hold on a plant. It might reduce the level of damage you might see in the beans, but again, there's going to be a number of factors on what kind of damage you'll see if you try a fungicide there. If I were going to be making a late application of a fungicide, it would be probably farther towards our 5 or our 6 to try to really control that late season disease pressure on the pods. Because if we spray more towards our 3, we might miss that window of protection. So if you're trying to limit the damage to the beans, it's going to require a much later application.
I'm also planning to work with BASF on some trials for Revitec and Preaxor this year on some indeterminate.
So we've used the Revitec in the past in several of our fungicide evaluation trials, and we've seen good control of our pathogens. So for that, it does work well as a fungicide. So if there's disease pressure, it's not a bad option.
I know this is not a seed production question exactly, but what about the use of desiccation late in the season to try to eliminate some of the seed quality issues you may have?
Yeah, so Jay, that is a question that we get a lot in respects to these earlier maturing varieties, especially when planted early. I'm gonna let Dr. Wes Everman talk about this. He's done some work on desiccation. But what I can say from talking to the other soybean agronomists that I work with in the Mid-South, often, you have to desiccate past R6, R6.5. Often growers in the Mid-South are desiccating too late to really make it pay a lot in value, but hopefully Wes can weigh in on this.
Yeah, for for us, Dr. Dunphy and I did some work looking at timing, and really what it played out. Now, this was all May and June planted beans, so I think we need to redo this maybe with earlier planted beans. But the earlier we sprayed, the less yield we got, is basically what we saw until frost. So the type of beans we were using, I don't think really set us up to make a fair assessment of, making a spray and is it economical in most years. Part of why we did it, we were getting all these storms in the fall, and if we desiccate, how long does it take before we can harvest? And then, do we end up being able to preserve some yield as opposed to having stuff wiped out by flood or storm damage? So I think there's probably a balance on when we spray versus when we start losing money that we should probably dig into on these early beans.
And Jay, this is Catherine again. And so, yeah, I think it's a great question. And like Wes said, we probably need to look at this with early maturity groups. So we're also going to we're also funding work kind of to go in conjunction with the fungicide work on early maturity groups for seed quality, looking at desiccants as well. And that'll happen this year. So hopefully by the end of this year, we'll be able to have some answers, and we'll probably, repeat this study again for a couple years.
Hey, Wes, before we move off of this topic, can you just, based on the knowledge we have now, since we do get a lot of questions about this, can you just speak to your experience on the effectiveness you've seen of the various desiccants that can be used?
Yeah, sure. Ultimately, it boils down to coverage with most of our stuff. You got your D-fol, or your sodium chlorate, paraquat, and sharpen, really the ones that are going to kill the soybeans. You can use AIM, but it's primarily just going to be a excuse me a harvest aid, to clean up morning glories and stuff like that. It didn't really terminate the soybeans. Your interval to get back into the soybeans is probably the biggest factor for most folks in choosing your desiccant. The sharpen look good, as long as we got good coverage, and you can get back the quickest with the sharpen. Defol and paraquat also killed the beans very effectively. Just you have to wait 7 days to harvest with the defol, and then around 2 weeks with the paraquat. So most folks, if you're going to be killing them off, aren't wanting to wait that long, at least as far as we were looking at with potential storms coming. But most of the beans were killed within, 3 or 4 days with all the treatments anyway. So effectiveness, they all were fairly comparable. It just boils down to how long can you wait to get in there. So I'm pretty happy with our options. It's just going to be grower specific on probably what they choose.
Rachel, do you see the same trend away from double crop soybeans in other parts of the country that can accommodate it?
And I've not looked closely enough at what's going on with other states and their decline in double crop acreage or their decline in wheat yields to answer that.
And North Carolina has traditionally had probably more double crop acreage as a percentage of our total acreage than any other state.
Yeah, I would imagine it would be a southern thing, but I was just thinking with other southern states
Yeah,
seen
but
that
otherwise I don't have any data.
Okay.
There is some double crop going on Owen in Ohio, Southern Illinois, I guess what would be characterized as more Midwestern states, but it's as Catherine articulated, less prevalent than it is here.
Okay.
Other questions from folks? Any comments from growers that are implementing this system? We're hoping to have a dialogue here. We can learn from y'all too about, I think we've already heard some good research ideas, but would love feedback.
Dr. Van.
Yes.
Keith Beavers, Duplin County. Back to a fungicidal question. On the early planting beans that we're planting now, is there any type of in-furrow treatment that we can put rather than send them back, these beans back to the company to get them treated at this date?
Keith, I will answer from some research that's been done on the soybean extension program and then let Lindsay weigh in if they've done any fungicidal in furrow work. But what I can say is in the soybean extension program, when Dr. Dumphy was looking at those non-foliar yield enhancement products over the past few years, they did look at some in-furrow fungicide applications, which had very limited impact on yield. I'd have to look back at the article we just summarized to say exactly what those impacts were, but they were minimal. I can send you over that article. I don't know if Lindsay has anything to add on in-furrow fungicide applications.
Sure. There's a couple of labeled fungicides for soybeans that we can use in furrow. Since you're probably looking at cooler, wet conditions, you might run into some issues with Pythium and Rhizoctonia, which means you'll want to use a true fungicide that has activity on Rhizoctonia and something like Ridomil that would take care of the Pythium problem. So it is possible to do in-furrow treatments. They're just probably going to be a little bit more expensive than a seed treatment because the seeds are, you're putting a much lower amount of AI out and instead of doing it in a tank mix, if that makes sense. But they definitely would work. You just want to make sure that your treatments are directed right around the seed so that they are effective around the seed area.
And
Thank you.
One more agronomic comment. If you didn't want to get your soybeans treated and you were going to try to plant them in the next couple of weeks when it's been cooler and a little bit wetter, one option that you have is to just increase your seeding rate slightly, knowing that you might have a little bit more seedling disease pressure than you have historically using a later planting date.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from folks? I know we're running up on 9:30, but would love to stay on if there's additional input. Great. So one more question for the audience then. We would like to know if there's any other soybean topic webinars that you would like to have as we're getting going with the soybean season here. Any other topics that you would like to have covered in a similar format? Okay, well, one of the things we'll think about as extension specialists, when we start getting, 4, 5, 6 questions on the same topic, that might be a trigger to us that it would be good to host a educational event like this. But let's see what we've got. Comment in the chat. Cover cropping versus double cropping, that's definitely something we can consider, Jenny. And we appreciate everybody plugging in today. It seems like the security measures that we used today were effective. So hopefully we can move forward hosting these types event if there's interest. So thanks everybody, safe planting, and have a great week.